Welcome, folks. First, I want to say Happy International Women's Day. How rad of you that a way that you chose to celebrate is to come to this event. The ABCs of Inclusivity, a new approach to belonging with Jessy Santana. And I'm going to hand over to Jessy in just a moment.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So welcome everyone to the ABCs of Inclusivity. One of the things that I would love for us to do first is to honor traditional territories. So I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the traditional territories of the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka or Mohawk Nation, namely Montreal, Quebec, or Tioktoge. I would also like to recognize my ancestral lands of the Taino Arawak of Haiti and Quisqueya, namely Hispaniola, Dominican Republic, Haiti. So of course, we always want to make sure that we are learning and checking out sources that are by and for the groups in question. As we all know, history does not tell all of the stories. So if you're interested, Whos.land is a great resource. But I do also, again, encourage you to check out sources that are by and for the groups in question. So today we're going to start off with a little bit of positive participation. We always want to start off with these positive participation guidelines. And really this is just to make sure that we're entering this space with our best kind of energy. So it's really about no guilt or shame. This is a shared learning experience. And we don't know what we don't know, because we're all experts in our own diversity, but not in the diversity of others. And we also want to make sure that we're open-minded, right? Open-mindedness is paramount, and being open to the experience is greatly appreciated. I hope so from all of us here in this space. We also want to assume positive intent, center impact. We're in a collective space, feelings may come up, but we always want to assume positive intent, centering that impact and reflecting on what comes next. And of course, authenticity. This is about being ourselves. And if something does come up for you, you can send me a direct message. You can write, please do not read, if it's just for a conversation or a question between us. And I will respect that comment or reflection. And then you can also step away and do what you need to do to take care of yourself. But we hope that you come back. I sincerely hope that you come back. I believe it's by stretching ourselves, real growth can begin. That's why I don't remember childbirth, but I have the stretch marks to prove it, right? So we also want to start off with Vegas rules, right? I grew up in Vegas, so what happens in the session stays in the session. And that's really because we want to make sure that we're co-creating and connecting and keeping that air of confidentiality. Consent is always nice. So if something resonates with you, make sure you keep the stories with you, but you leave the names behind. And I do understand that we're being recorded, so that's a thing. So also be aware of that, right? So if there's something that you haven't taken the sting out of in our conversation today, maybe choose another venue in which to talk about it. So with that being said, if we can agree to these positive participation guidelines, if you can give me a thumbs up, a yes in the chat box, whatever works for you, a physical thumbs, I like that. Thank you. All right. So a little bit about me. My name is Jessy Santana, Jessy Santana. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a light-skinned Afro-Latina with curly hair, a queer mother, recovering from postpartum depression. I'm originally from Dominican Republic. I grew up in Vegas, spent my 20s in China, and now I live in Montreal, Quebec. I speak 3 languages, and I'm working on my 4th, which is French, which is different than Quebecois, so if you're not aware. But I chose this particular quote by Audre Lorde because my personal story of belonging has always been one of internalized fear. As an immigrant or alien in the US, keeping my head down, doing good work, and hoping somebody would notice was a familiar place for me. My father used to tell us inside we're Dominican, but outside we're American. So I've always had this in-betweener perspective. But I have always been finding places and people to belong with. And so this is what really led me to create the ABCs of Inclusivity. And so after having worked in learning and development for over 10 years, the last 5 in diversity, equity, and inclusion, I know that the way we talk about organizational learning is to go for intensity. The retreats, the half-day, week intensive, the removed, idealized places to learn away from the actual work but it didn't work for me. But I also knew that it didn't work for those I was teaching, especially when I saw them again and again asking the same questions about how do you model this behavior? How do you introduce it to my actual position? How do you bring it into the everyday? Remembering that 80% of companies have unconscious bias training, but we see that systemic bias is still a thing, right? So something needs to change. So I wanted to propose a more intentional and more systems-based approach to learning around diversity and inclusion in an incremental and developmental way. And this is what I came up with. This is my first time sharing it publicly, so please be gentle. But I would love to know your thoughts. I really believe that it is in collaboration that this work can continue to grow and be sustainable. I pull from data science, adult learning, design thinking, systems thinking, and much more, lived experience also. I also see this as phases where one builds on top of the other, but depending on how we come to this space, we may have a deeper knowledge than others and navigate through the learnings quicker and are able to model the inclusive behaviors faster than others. But it's still a personal journey as much as an organizational one. So given that, what we're going to do is we're just going to go through each one. I put some examples of the kinds of learning for each sort of phase. But please, if you have any questions, comments, but before we begin, if Lisa, if you could launch that poll, I would love to know sort of where people are on their journey as we are today. Thank you all for participating and letting me know where you might be. I see lots of people are still, in the beginning, middle. Some of us are more advanced than others, and that's great. So thank you so much for sharing that. The first part is awareness. And so when we think of awareness, this is usually where a lot of organizations are doing book clubs, they're doing, learnings, or maybe once in a while there's a conversation around. A lot of the work is really on the individual. And that's great and that's fine. But if there's not a lot of intentionality behind it, we generally are not really great at keeping that self-motivation, keeping that momentum moving forward. If you're not aware, 2023, there's a lot of conversations around diversity and inclusion fatigue. And this is something that is of concern because I think that when we are always coming from a place of leadership down, this is because of the industry this way, or this other organization is doing it, so we now need to do it. It's not actually looking at your particular organization's workforce, right? It's not understanding what it is that you need specifically. And it's just about comparison with another organization where you may be just throwing things at the wall and hoping something sticks. But the reality is it's not implementable. It's not something that people can actually use. And so when we look at the different types of concepts within this phase of awareness, it's really moving away from the voluntold, the fear-based sort of division discourse that comes up around diversity and inclusion, and really understanding what we ourselves have internalized and come to the conversation with. I truly believe that we're all cultural beings, which is why I talk a lot about cultural intelligence. And for me, I know that it's not until I, in 2020, had the privilege of doing an oral history assignment, well, not assignment because I assigned it to myself, but work with my Black grandmother, that I realized that in some ways, the way that language in the Caribbean has grown and developed is very specific to those internalized narratives. Where I remember as a child, my dad would say things like, "Oh, your mom married me because she wanted to have whiter babies." Or, my grandmother telling me stories of my great grandmother and the division that occurred between, my grandfather marrying a Black woman. And so all of that conversation still exists. It's very, for me, it's something that I've had to peel apart, which is why I didn't do this work before, because I had to do some of that internal work. But this is really where you understand what comes up for you in this space. And you can start to peel apart those layers of how we can demonstrate and prepare ourselves for further conversations around diversity and inclusion. So through each phase, we're also increasing our capacity, and that once insurmountable, lofty vision becomes more attainable and accessible. In belief and belonging, we start to connect with our ideas, our values, and how we create cultures of belonging and community across teams and across knowledge base. How many of you have ever been in a training or a session, and there tends to be catering to people who know less about the subject matter, and almost an emotional burden on those that come from those lived experiences, right? And so it's important that there is a leveled learning approach to this, where it's not, yes, I always talk about co-creating brave spaces of intentional inclusivity and fierce belonging, but I know that in order to get to the brave, we need to go through the safe first. So was that experience that has been traditionally, what has that experience been like from a traditionally dominant perspective and a non-dominant perspective? And how can we change it, right? How are we taking what we learned in awareness and applying it to ourselves and our communal spaces? And again, I want to emphasize that this is deeply personal work. And it's in this phase that we're moving from just ingesting material to now reflecting on what we do, what we come into this space with, and how can we start to change some of those internalized narratives. Uncomfortability were a series of workshops that I ran in 2020 around feeling discomfort when it comes to difficult conversations. Reflection, using some trauma-informed techniques, and expanding our ability to choose to take on that emotional and intellectual labor on ourselves and do some of that heavy lifting and not relying on others to do it for us. So I can still feel, the roar in my ears from every situation I have been in where I wish someone had said something on my behalf, instead of just waiting for the lone woman of color to say something, or the times I laughed along, even when the butt of the joke was a part of my identity, because I didn't feel safe enough to do otherwise. It's not easy taking up space or using your voice in these situations, but it does come with practice. Even I took anti-Asian hate bystander training during the pandemic because I know how to navigate as Jessy Santana in the world for the most part, but I wanted to also have tools to support my Chinese family. So again, I took that labor upon myself. No one asked me to do it, right? But I knew that I needed to be able to have the tools to be able to assist me in being able to navigate what happens in case of, right? And so again, taking some of that labor onto ourselves to be able to better prepare for the next phases to follow. So in community and co-creation, we can now have communal spaces where people can engage in respectful discourse and share ideas by having a different understanding of what the conversation is that they need to be having. Vulnerability and transparency are essential leadership skills, but at some places and in some organizations, they're also thought of as undermining or discrediting a leader's abilities to lead. But that's why I ascribe to culture-driven leadership, which refers to a people-first methodology of building culture and developing others. A client once told me, everyone says we're at the start of our journey, but the reality is we're still tying our shoes. And what that meant for me was that a lot of people, again, are being put into spaces they're not ready for, and immediately defenses go up. And we start seeing more division and fear pop up, and less money is invested in these initiatives and programs. And even, sometimes it creates even more animosity, which is what we want to get away from, right? Where we're being intentional about the process and making sure that we're creating those spaces for people to understand what comes up for them. I wholeheartedly believe that in order for these things to be sustainable, we need to also understand that a lot of times it's that embodied experience of how these things make us feel that we remember. I love telling stories, and I probably will tell a few more here today, but it's those stories that people remember, not the theory or the concept, right? And so making sure that we are putting people, I mean, yes, we want to make people uncomfortable. We want to have people reflect, but we also want to have them to have moments where they can debrief from that feeling and that conversation, because that's also just as valuable. We don't want to leave people in those uncomfortable spaces and be like, good luck. I hope you figure it out on your own. That's where people are like, I don't want to feel that way again. I don't want to do this again. I don't want to, be here again. And we end up losing those valuable people, those allies, those community leads, the people that are willing to volunteer for these events and for all of these things to be able to continue doing the work. The next phase is diversity champion. And the first time I came across this term was at my first job after grad school. It was 2009 during the Great Recession, and I felt grateful for having any job at all. But I was struggling because everything I had learned in school was not at all what I was seeing at work. The people who had this moniker in their signature on emails were, in my opinion, some of the worst managers and leaders I'd ever met. And it was like a farce, and I didn't understand what the words actually meant. Finally, after months of pestering my VP, he finally allowed me to go to the famous diversity champion training. It was a 3-month program, lots of additional reading, discussion groups, and I felt like I was in school again. But now, after doing this work for a while, I don't recall them actually mentioning anything about diversity and inclusion, except maybe, explaining the company's commitment statement at the time. But it felt like a management class, again, a theoretical one based on Who Moved My Cheese and The Iceberg is Melting. Great books, but I didn't understand the connection. And so besides being a great way to get out of work for me, it didn't really deeply resonate. And so I found that if I, as a person of color, as a person that navigates the world in the spaces that I did, if I don't understand it, how would people that don't really want to have the conversation or don't really engage with the idea that everyone is a cultural being, how would they understand it? So fast forward to now, and for me, diversity champion actually comes forth in this framework because you can't begin to understand what these concepts are, ideas, and behaviors are until you've understood what came before, right? Allyship for me is something that I understand. I can't call myself an ally because that again centers me in the conversation and not those that I wish to ally with. And of course, if I can remember living on a cul-de-sac with super strict traditional parents and not only being allowed to ride my bike up and down the street on that cul-de-sac, if I know that I at that time could make friends with kids I had nothing in common with except for the fact that we lived on the same street, I know that allyship is a thing that we can all do. We just sort of learn the older we get to think so much about am I doing it right? Am I not doing it right? Am I am I saying the right way? How do I connect with people? We generally, I think as adults, forget how to make friends. And for me, the core of being an ally is really just friendship, right? So sometimes companies look again at what others in their industry or their field are doing, and they feel they also need to do it. But we also want to make sure that we are actually using pulse surveys, focus groups, whatever needs assessments we need in order to understand how it's impacting our current workforce. What are the things that they specifically need and want to bring into this conversation? We should also be continuously iterating and improving the employee experience for all. Again, we're not operating out of fear, guilt, or shame at this level. We're in the business of opportunity and being receptive to change. We spend a third of our time at work. It should be a place where we can all thrive. And so that's why modeling belonging as a leader is really important, because I've definitely been in situations where I was the only person of color, I was the only woman, I was the youngest person on the team, but because my leader made me feel connected, involved, listened to, respected, and even implemented some of the things that I brought up. That was a team that I used to, compare other teams to, even when there was more representation. As we all know, representation doesn't always mean inclusion, right? So it's important to know what it looks like, right? Again, that embodied experience. I'm sure we all have experiences of, leaders that rubbed us the wrong way, made us feel like we didn't matter, like we were just cogs in the machine, worker bees. And those are the things that we also remember of that experience at work, right? Our brain, for some odd reason, loves negative things. And so we want to make sure that we're not just ascribing that negative feedback, but we also want to take it as a learning opportunity. And of course, career mapping. I think that a lot of times organizations assume because they have learning, they have, HR in place, they're doing initiatives. But if people do not know how they can go from where they are to where they want to be internally into an organization, you can't even invite them to have a conversation in the hiring process because they don't see a future for themselves in that organization. My mother always told me you can't invite people over if your house is dirty. And a lot of organizations, they have filthy homes. But instead of just only focusing on the conversation of the diversity pipeline, we also need to make sure that we're looking at retainment. What does that look like? What is our turnover? What it costs more to hire somebody new than it does to keep the people we have. So what is it that we're missing out on? And have we considered, and this is something that I just learned about a few years ago, but an employee alumni model. I was like, that is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard, because when people look at an organization, right, they check out the reviews, they check out the glass doors, people share what their experience was. And if you have people that have positive experiences, and maybe they simply left because they didn't, not for anything negative, but they were just looking for something else, then you have an opportunity there to have somebody speak on your behalf, and just like any other person, right? Any other alumni of an organization, it's something that they could speak on your behalf. And we all listen to reviews much more than we listen to what the website says or what the marketing says, right? So it's important to, again, see that when we are thinking about all of these different parts, it's something that helps to make that a core model of the culture of the organization, right? And not just something that we say, but something that we do. I think that especially in the conversation around, for me, diversity and inclusion is not just, a part of learning. It's not just part of HR. It's something that needs to be imbibed in the culture of an organization. And one of those things is, do we see ourselves in the organization? And if we don't, how likely are we to stay? I remember I was interviewing for a VC firm, and I looked at their team, and the only person on the team that was not a white male was the HR person. And I was like, interesting. So you want me to come in as a diversity and inclusion person and do what exactly? Because I can't fix it all, right? So it's really important to, yes, have this be a part of the conversation. Because am I going to come in and it's going to be constant pushback? Are we open and receptive to the change that I might propose and recommend? So this final stage is equity. So for me as a child, I had two different approaches to life modeled by my parents. My father spent years, time, money on accent reduction classes, ESL, certifications and equivalencies for his educational background abroad. I can hear my mother saying, if they don't understand what I'm saying, that's their problem. So two very different approaches to the same thing, which is acculturation, which is fitting into the dominant culture. Alberto Aragon from A Walk in the Clouds said this, and this is one of my favorite quotes about this: just because I talk with an accent doesn't mean I think with one. That's why I love cultural intelligence, which for me is closely aligned to code switching. And it just talks about someone's ability to navigate situations and spaces where they're not familiar with. And because I really believe that we're all cultural beings, it's not just for multinationals anymore. Demographic, generational, intercultural lived experiences all shape how we show up, and moving from culture fit to culture add is a really important step to equity. And and it's different, it's so different to equality. So if we're still operating from a place of reaction or performative inaction or overwhelm, we're probably not preparing for the inclusive future of work. So if we could take some key learnings from these last few years, institutions that were adamant that they could never do remote or hybrid were forced to. And while some are now trying to go back, it's also important to understand what it gave us. We adapted to change quickly and efficiently. We had greater accessibility on all fronts, to partnering with communities that were new to us and not regionally bound. We had flex schedules that gave caregivers greater autonomy and balance, and engaged in conversations like we never have before. So I think that instead of saying things like, oh, we want to go back to the way things were pre-COVID, could we take learnings from what occurred during these COVID times, right? Some of the things that came out of this is so important to understand. While yes, not everything is sustainable with everyone being remote, I really believe that if we're intentional about remote cultures, you can have those kismet water cooler talks. You just have to make sure that you're putting it into the culture that you're building and creating, right? Not everyone is going to have the same experience across the board, but not everyone has the same experience across the board when we're in person either. But again, it allows us to greater connect to communities that we may not have, previously considered. I have a friend who, all of a sudden they were not regionally bound when it came to their hiring. And so they were able to partner with HBCUs, with, different organizations and partnerships that allowed their recruiting process to completely transform. And so they were seeing now a very wide array of candidates instead of what they had traditionally been given. So what are we striving for? It's that we want to create these workplaces where we all have the ability to have what we need. If we're fans of the platinum rule, it's not about, it's about allowing people to tell us what they need and making sure that we're receptive to it. It's not about giving everything that they want, which is very different, right? But what is it that you need? For example, I remember being asked by my manager, what is it that you need to be successful in this previous employment, where I don't think in the last 20 years of working, I'd ever been asked that by a supervisor. So I was like, I had to take a moment to think about it. And because it was all remote, I realized that what I needed was to be able to talk to someone. I needed to be able to have conversations. I was accustomed to being at home with a toddler, and it was, I read emails and I would read tone. And I'm like, that doesn't sound right. Are we having the same conversation? So for me, it was important that we had one-on-ones, and we kept them up, right, weekly. Now, it didn't always happen. Some things came up in the organization and we had to reschedule, but we made the effort to have those one-on-one conversations, to make time to connect with each other, even if it was for 10, 15 minutes, half an hour. And so for me, all of that anxiety that built up from all of the constant multi-channel approach of communication eased, because I now had a filter where I could ask questions to directly, as opposed to just sitting, with the Slacks, with the Zoom calls, with the emails and everything in between. So I think also something that a lot of organizations go to first is policy change. Now, policy is absolutely important for making these things sustainable when it comes to diversity and inclusion. But it also is important to understand exactly what kind of policies we need. A lot of organizations have we're an equal employer, And that's the minimum effort required to exist, I think, in the US. However, what does that actually mean? What does that actually look like? And do we have other opportunities to look at our policies and say, is that equitable, or are we missing things from it? Right? I remember for me, I used to be an on-call employee, and I never thought to question whether or not if I was called, the day before, if I was called an hour before, if I was called at any point in time. And it was something that I never thought to question. I just assumed I got to go to work. I can't have boundaries. And so it's Vegas, it's 24 hours every day. We have to make it happen. But it's something that, again, we need to be reflecting on and understanding what are the things that we need for our organization, right? Yes, exactly. Alta gracia. The organizational culture, what is it, the culture that we're trying to strive for? Is it a culture where we have more accountability within these conversations? Is it a culture where people are able to create those brave spaces? Are we creating a culture where we're leaning into curiosity and learning? I think that when I came back from having lived in China for 6 years to North America, my reverse culture shock in a lot of ways was greater than when I'd originally left. I expected things to be different in China, but when I came back and I had learned also to take up space, I think that for me, that was the first place where the only thing they cared about was that I had a blue American passport, and that was it. And I had so much privilege as an expat, I will say. But I also was like, oh, people listen to me when I speak. People see me as a credible authority figure, as opposed to when I came back, then I had people questioning, are you sure? Do you know what you're talking about? You've done this XYZ, but now you're talking about this. How does it apply? Do you have transferable skills? Showing up to a conversation and showing up as Jessy Santana is something that I'm quite comfortable with. But my married name is actually Jessy Yen. And I don't know how to navigate that conversation in North America yet, because my first thing is, what if I show up and you're expecting a Chinese man? What does that mean for me? And are we going to have to do this? Am I going to see the gear shifting in your head as you sort of move and shift to, okay, so this is not what I was expecting. And so it's really important to understand, again, how are we sustaining this? How are we having these conversations? How are we moving forward? So that it's not just on the marginalized to keep it up, right? We need everyone to opt into the conversation. We need everyone to continue to not just look at it from a place of pressure of what's happening societally, what's happening internally. Do we have people who are leading these things? Are we paying them? Are we just expecting volunteers? I think that for me, especially and this is the reason why I have been thinking about this and ruminating about it for so long, is because I can't unknow what I know. Like, I look at marketing and I see it through an equity lens. I look through operations and I see it through an equity lens. I look at, R&D and I see it through an equity lens. And that's because it is a part of everything that we do. If you want more market share, why are you not hiring more people that come from different communities than the ones that you've already tapped out on? Why are you not having conversations with different types of suppliers and manufacturers that might give us different opportunities for what we're creating? Why are you not, having different influencers and making different contracts with different ambassadors that could, again, reach different organizations in different communities? So everything for me is absolutely a part of this conversation. It's not just in one area, but it's in the whole organization as a whole. And so I just want to share my first job at 16. I worked at New York in an arcade on the Las Vegas Strip. And that was my first foray into work life. And 3 things occurred to me in that one particular job. First, I had privilege. The reason I found out about that position was my mom saw it on a newsletter. She was working at MGM, which also owned New York. She went with me, and when I was too scared to have the conversation, I was an extremely shy kid, and asked for an application, she went with me and made me fill it out and turned it in. And so I had someone fighting for me, right? But then I also had marginalization, because in the interview, I remember the hiring manager making fun of me because my only government IDs were my passport and my alien card, which were both of me as a child. Now, in that moment, I remember thinking, this is just the way that it is. This is just what I need to do in order to get what I need to, which is a paycheck. Because my parents, had already been working 2 or 3 jobs to help us get the education that we needed, and I wanted to contribute. But I also remember reading in the contract that I was a representative of the organization on and off property. And I remember asking to myself, does that mean that the organization is a representative for me? And I can tell you that it wasn't. And I think that a lot of organizations don't think of that. They think of, you're here to substitute your time in exchange for pay. And that's all that we do. But we need to really rethink workforce development, especially for that inclusive future of work, which is not and should not be what we are currently doing and what we have previously done. Diversity and inclusion has been a conversation for a long time, longer than I've been alive, maybe some of you in this room. And so we need to start thinking about how to imbibe that culture of inclusion throughout all levels of an organization with all participants, so that it's not just on the most marginalized to, again, keep up that momentum. So I would love for us to just share any thoughts, any feedback, any questions. You can always connect with me on LinkedIn, Cultivate, hello@thewaywework.com, whatever works for you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much for world premiering this with us. I'm really honored to have witnessed it and to hear your stories. And folks, if you have a question, I would love to bring it to Jessy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, thank you ever so much. I am just so completely bowled over by everything you've said. My question to you, first of all, thank you. And
Thank you.
my question is, where do you find the courage to start this conversation? So I've been doing this work for a long time. I'm an old woman. Thank God for this being an audio for me. But it's just gotten to the point where sometimes I am beyond exhausted. And I hear the leadership talking about, well, you got to be courageous. And, it's only the people who will speak up. That's how change will happen. And I totally agree with it. What I find is that majority of the times I've spoken up, I've been burnt. And so sometimes I just get tired. And I think at my end, I just say, I'm going to take care of myself. So, I think what I'm really looking for, and perhaps it's from everyone, is where do we go to find that, or just to kind of continue that fire going inside? What do we do?
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I deeply resonated with that. I think to answer your question in the only way that I know how, I did not do this work for a very long time for the same reason. I did not want to put myself out there. I didn't want to be the troublemaker. I didn't want to be seen as somebody who was causing, discomfort for others. And when I had my child, and knowing that they were going to have a different experience in the world than what I was going to have, because I couldn't protect them from it, and I, having lived in this world, knew that it was going to be different for them. Even as I, walk down the street with my husband, sometimes people are like, how does that work? How are you together? One of the things that keeps me going is that, and that forever will be my North Star, is my family. But also, sometimes you do need to rest. Sometimes, like, my word for this year is finding self-healing, is finding ways to do this work where I'm not hitting my head on the wall. And I don't want to have to convince people that this is important. That's not where I need to be, because I am inflicting harm on myself by being in that conversation. That's why I generally still am connecting with people who are already interested. And I thank Lisa for agreeing to have this thing, because there's like 23 people here who seem to be interested in having the conversation. But I also know that, yes, it is, again, as an embodied experience, our bodies are the experience that are not always welcome. And so going into a space where you already have that in your head, it takes a lot of courage just existing. So, and taking up space, right? So when people who come from a dominant experience, and this is why I also like the intercultural development inventory as an assessment, because it looks at, according to their research, where you are versus where you would like to be, and the things that you need to be able to get there. So again, it's that intent versus impact, right? And I think that a lot of people, again, from a dominant experience, navigate the world without having to think about a lot of things. And when you then come from a non-dominant experience, you're thinking about all of the things. And so it's important to, again, this is, for me, this is not, sometimes work or all the time work. This is life's work. And so I don't know how to not do this, because again, I can't unknow what I know. But I also want to be mindful, because I can burn out. Otherwise, I can't do this work. So absolutely, healing is a part of it. Absolutely making sure that you are filling your cup. Absolutely making sure that you have people around you that are supporting you, even if it's not at work, right? Even if it's not within those leadership conversations. But I don't think that until actual sustainable change happens, that we can let it go. Like, this is part of the influences for this framework, is also the UN sustainability goals. The UN has been around forever, and yet we're still talking about the same things. Those 13 sustainability goals are still talking about the same things. And so we need to really understand and break apart the stuff that we're doing in some ways to understand what is it that we actually need. So I hope that helps. Again, this is not the end all and be all, but I know that I cannot go back to putting my head down and not doing and not being a part of this conversation. So thank you for what you shared as well. Leon, you have your hand up.
Hi. First, Jessy, thank you for this and for having us be present at the world premiere. No, seriously, like, kudos, really valuable stuff. Would like to chat with you about it, some other time. I have so many questions, but one thing that from your stories that really hit home. So I'm the managing director of Conscious Thrive Consulting. We work on DEI issues as well. And one thing that consistently comes up when we run and conduct our focus groups and qualitative research interviews is this feeling from the non-dominant groups that, it's like, it's strange and weird to have to ask people to care for you, right? This feeling like what we're, and I saw in the comments as well, it's like, it's the bare minimum. It's like basic. Like, it's weird to have to ask for our supposed leaders in our institution to care for us. Again, to even ask us a question, what do you need? You talked about the platinum rule, treat others the way they want to be treated, not just the way, etc. And you also mentioned, that time when you're interviewing for the C-suite and you saw that it was all men and all white men and one, non-dominant group rep, and that rep was from HR. And it's like, what do you expect of me, right? So one question that I know is in the minds of a lot of non-dominant folks who I've interviewed, and also myself, right, is one of the biggest challenges, is how do you get, let's say, those dominant groups, those white men in that board, in that C-suite, to care, like really care beyond just like, oh, we want to do DEI because it's going to increase our diversity of voices, and therefore that's going to help us be more effective to get profit, right? But nothing about like, well, it's about what can DEI do for them as leaders and the institution, and not even considering that DEI is really there to repair the harms caused by the institution, whether intentionally or not, especially on its workers and communities they serve. How would you enter that conversation with those leaders? And what would you say to the non-dominant groups to help build trust?
I think that, yes, I absolutely agree with Betty in the comments. That's part of the reason why I was almost afraid to do this work, because I was afraid to feel like, am I an advocate then for myself to be in this room? How does that work? Because yes, we have generally these spaces where people are still in the performative, people are still doing it because it's a business case conversation. But that's also the reason why, for me, my framework is not about how do you get from A to E without thinking about how does it reflect for you? Because if you're not aware of what you come to the conversation with, if you're like, oh, I'm a super inclusive leader, my door is always open, nobody walks through, and you never question why that happened, then that's something that we need to think about. And I think that a lot of people, Insights is a great book, that people are not as self-aware as they think they are. They don't know a lot of these things. And I would say that primarily, not everyone, but primarily people are just not aware. And they say and repeat things that are not, we're on the other side, the receiving side might be like, are you really sure that you just said that? And I will say that for me, like, for example, my dad, he didn't understand Me Too at all. He was like, I don't know why people are talking about something that happened 20 years ago, especially when Brett Kavanaugh was coming into office, and then he was like, I don't understand this. And so what I did was I had a conversation with him. I brought the WHO released a report that 1 in 3 women will face sexual violence in their lifetime. And he has 3 daughters. And I told him of an incident that happened to me at work when I was 17. And of course, he was like, oh my God, I had no idea. Why didn't you tell me that when you were 17? And I was like, listen, puppy, like, you need to understand what kind of relationship we had at 17. I didn't tell you a lot of things. So again, it's about humanizing the experience for everyone, because we come to things not realizing what we have in our own personal baggage that we may need to unlearn before we can actually learn. I think we also need to, again, when it comes to leadership, it's important to grab their attention with that kind of language around the business case, because that's what they've been taught in business school and yada yada. But we also need to bring them to the conversation of, what does this feel like for you? What comes up for you when you hear these things? What when you share, oh, now I'm interested in anti-Black racism because I have a Black grandchild. What is that? How does that show? Why didn't you care about it before? And so again, coming from that place of curiosity and learning is what will move people from the bare minimum to now they want to learn more. Now they want to be a part of the conversation, and hopefully then in turn be the kind of leaders that we need to be, right? Because demographics are changing, and Gen Zers, they don't care. So if that's the only motivation that you have right now, you need to step back and reflect, right? So definitely, I mean, it's a hard one. That is like the number one thing that we need to figure out and crack, but it's definitely something important.
I see folks are already asking for an encore and a part two, which I very much agree with. This framework is so human-centered and so thoughtful. And I hope that a lot of folks here are thinking about it in their organizations. I hope that you and your work get to spread it to a lot of organizations, because I think this is a way we can move forward together, even if we're in different places to start.
Yeah, absolutely. It's only through collaboration, not competition, that we will be able to do this work.
So Jessy, just want to honor that, like, I know you're an expert, but it's scary to share a brand new framework with a whole bunch of people in a Zoom room. So like, major props to you for being willing to do this. And we're also lucky to have witnessed it. Thank you so, so much. And
Thank
folks,
you. And thank you everyone for being here as well, and being a part of the process.